America first. That's because whether it's North Korea, Iran, Syria, even Israel, what you have now is a clear departure, not just from the previous administration's approach, but from Washington orthodoxy. In each case, for example, in North Korea, you also have a policy of engagement bathed in subtle aggression, but also tempered by the promise of cooperation.
America's track record of support for the Korean people is second to none. If North Korea takes bold action to quickly denuclearize, the United States is prepared to work with North Korea to achieve prosperity on the par with our South Korean friends.
In the Middle East, the administration's rejection of Washington orthodoxy also on full display as Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump represent the country as the U.S. Embassy moves from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, a move seen as a symbolic and a diplomatic stake in the ground in full-throated support of the Israelis and against the growing influence of Tehran in the region, which was further disrupted by the president's decision to break the terms of the Iran nuclear agreement this week. There is talk, Chris, that decision by the president emboldened the Iranians to attack the Israelis. As you know, the Israelis struck back, hitting Iranian targets in Syria. It is also certain that they have tacit support in Washington to do so. Chris?
Kevin Corke reporting from the White House. Kevin, thanks for that. And joining us now, the new and very busy Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. Mr. Secretary, welcome back to Fox News Sunday.
Good morning, Chris. It's great to be with you.
Let's start with breaking news. First of all, that savage attack last night in Paris, a Chechen knifing, killing one person, wounding 4 others. What can you tell us about a possible link to terror?
Well, we don't know much more. We know that the Caliphate, ISIS, has claimed responsibility. They said he was one of their soldiers. We can't verify that yet. The French authorities, with all the intelligence help the United States can provide, will do our best to unpack this in the coming hours.
Okay, let's talk about some other breaking news. The North Koreans announced yesterday that they are going to blow up their nuclear site in 10 to 12 days. How big a development is this? And is that, do we believe, their only nuclear test site?
Chris, it's good news. Every single site that the North Koreans have that can inflict risk upon the American people, that is destroyed, eliminated, dismantled, is good news for the American people and for the world. And so this is one step along the way. I had a good set of meetings this past week aimed at heading in exactly this direction.
I want to go back to the comment, and Kevin just played it, your comment on Friday that if Kim chooses the, quote, right path, the U.S. is prepared to work with North Korea to, quote, achieve prosperity. What does that mean in terms of direct U.S. investment in North Korea? And are we, as part of this, willing, in effect, to guarantee Kim's security, that regime change will be off the table?
Chris, here's what this will look like. This will be Americans coming in, private sector Americans, not the U.S. taxpayer. Private sector Americans coming in to help build out the energy grid. They need enormous amounts of electricity in North Korea. To work with them to develop infrastructure, all the things that the North Korean people need, the capacity for American agriculture to support North Korea so they can eat meat and have healthy lives. Those are the kind of things that if we get what it is the president has demanded, the complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization of North Korea, that the American people will offer in spades.
And as part of that, are we in effect saying to Kim, if you give us what we want, you can stay on in power?
We will have to provide security assurances to be sure. This has been the trade-off that has been pending for 25 years. No president has ever put America in a position where the North Korean leadership thought that this was truly possible, that the Americans would actually do this, would lead to the place where America was no longer held at risk by the North Korean regime. That's the objectives. When I said earlier this week that I think Chairman Kim shares the objectives of the American people, I'm convinced of that. Now the task is for President Trump and he to meet to validate the process by which this would go forward, to set out those markers so that we can negotiate this outcome.
Do you have any problem, given Kim's history and the history of his family as an oppressive regime, any problems with the idea of the U.S., even if we get our deal, in effect giving a security guarantee to the Kim regime?
Look, we'll have to see how the negotiations proceed, but make no mistake about it. America's interest here is preventing the risk that North Korea will launch a nuclear weapon into L.A. or Denver or into the very place we're sitting here this morning, Chris. That's our objective. That's the end state the president has laid out, and that's the mission that he sent me on this past week, to put us on the trajectory to go achieve that.
Let's talk about denuclearization. The objective. 2 weeks ago, National Security Advisor John Bolton sat in this very seat, and he told me that the U.S. negotiating position going in is that Kim has to ship out, has to dismantle and take out of the country all of his nuclear weapons, all of his nuclear infrastructure, all of his long-range missiles before the U.S. will grant any concessions. On the other hand, this week, Kim met with Chinese President Xi, and he called for, quote, phased and synchronous measures. In other words, action for action. Have you and Kim agreed what the sequencing is? Is it all of the actions by him first, or is it step by step? And is that something, as I say, that you've agreed with, or is it something that Kim and the president will have to work out at the summit?
Chris, we've had discussions on how this would proceed. There's still a great deal of detail to be worked on, and in the coming weeks, we will continue to work on that so that we can be in a good spot on June 12th in Singapore for President Trump. But make no mistake about it, we've done this before, right? We've done trade for trade, moment for moment. You give me X, I give you Y, and it has failed repeatedly. I think Chairman Kim understands that. I think he appreciates the fact that this is going to have to be different and big and special and something that has never been undertaken before. If we're going to get to this historic outcome, both sides have to be prepared to take truly historic measures to achieve it.
And how confident are you? Because you're going to be putting the President of the United States in a room with Kim in Singapore, with the whole world watching. How confident are you that not only he understands it, but that he's going to deliver on our expectations?
Well, to quote President Trump, we'll see. Right? We are not to the place yet where we should be remotely close to declaring that we've achieved what it is we want. There's a great deal of work that remains. Our eyes are wide open with respect to the risks. But it is our fervent hope that Chairman Kim wants to make a strategic change in the direction for his country and his people. And if he's prepared to do that, President Trump is prepared to assure that this could be a successful transition.
All right, I want to talk about that. That you've said that we understand, and John Bolton talked about that nobody in the administration is starry-eyed. The president has been raising expectations for this summit, saying he thinks that they're going to make a great deal, his phrase. Your predecessor at the CIA, John Brennan, says he thinks that's playing into Kim's hands. Take a look.
I think that we're going to have a success. I think this will be a very big success.
I think he has been masterful in how he has manipulated perceptions and how he's manipulated and quite frankly, duped Mr. Trump.
Is it a mistake for the president to predict a, quote, great success?
I think former Director Brennan's remarks are silly on their face. We're going to enter into a set of discussions with two nations doing their best to achieve outcomes for their own people that are consistent with their objectives and goals. I think we now understand that there is the potential that there are shared objectives, and our mission is to prepare the groundwork. And we're pretty far along the way in doing so, and we'll continue to work in the days ahead, 30 left, to prepare for June 12th. So the president can have a successful outcome, that the two of them can meet and see if there is sufficient overlap so that we can achieve the ultimate objective for the American people.
After you brought the American hostages home and the whole world celebrated that, President Trump praised Kim for releasing them, and that praise, not the release of the hostages, but that praise upset some critics. Take a look at this.
Kim Jong-un did a great service to himself, to his country, by doing this.
We can't be fooled into giving the North Korean regime credit for returning Americans that never should have been detained in the first place.
According to your State Department's latest report, North Korea still holds at least 80,000 political prisoners in its labor camps and other facilities. Is human rights an issue in this summit, or is it just going to be about the nuclear issue?
Yeah, Chris, this administration is always concerned about human rights. It's the case. Not only are there political prisoners that remain in North Korea, there are Americans held around the world by other rogue regimes, too. I can assure you, this administration, I saw it in my role as director of the CIA, and I've seen it now in my first 2.5 weeks as Secretary of State, is intently focused on achieving the return of each of those as well. We had a success this week. We're happy for those families and for America that those 3 Americans returned home. But we recognize there's much work to do. We still have Americans held, and we're working diligently on behalf of each and every one of them.
When people found out that you were going to be on the program today, they all have the same question. I must say I did. What is Kim like? With the possible exception of Dennis Rodman, you have spent more time with him than any other Westerner, at least 2.5 hours, the way I figure it. What is he like? Give us any kind of personal insight. How aware is he of what President Trump has been saying? Was there any mention of Little Rocket Man?
Well, I've got a lot fewer rebounds than Dennis Rodman, but I did get to spend a great deal of time with Chairman Kim. The conversations are professional. He knows his brief. He knows what he is trying to achieve for the North Korean people. He's able to deal with complexity when the conversation requires it. He does follow the Western press. He'll probably watch this show at some point. He's paying attention to things that the world is saying. He, too, is preparing for June 12th. He and his team will be working with them to put our two leaders in a position where it's just possible we might pull off a historic undertaking.
Was there any mention of the exchange of insults back and forth?
No, we didn't cover that, Chris.
That's probably wise. I want to turn to, there's a lot on your brief. Iran and Israel got into an armed conflict across the Syrian border this week after President Trump pulled out of the nuclear deal with Tehran. Do you think that there's any connection, that Iran feels less constrained now that the U.S. no longer is part of this, this deal about Iran nukes?
That's ludicrous. It's ludicrous to suggest that Iran feels less constrained when during the JCPOA they have now fired missiles into an airport where Americans travel each day in Riyadh. They've now fired missiles into Israel. To suggest that somehow the withdrawal from the JCPOA is driving the Iranian conduct that's taken place during the JCPOA in Yemen, the rise of Hezbollah, all of those things took place during the JCPOA. Indeed, I would argue that they felt they could act with impunity. They watched Europe put exactly 0 sanctions on their missile program during the JCPOA. I think Rouhani and Zarif need to explain why it's the case that while this agreement was in place, Iran continued its march across the Middle East.
President Trump made it clear that he's not only going after Iran, but he's also prepared to sanction European companies that continue to do business in Tehran. Here is the president.
We will be instituting the highest level of economic sanction. Any nation that helps Iran in its quest for nuclear weapons could also be strongly sanctioned by the United States.
But the leaders of France, of Germany, of Britain all say that they're going to stay in the deal and they're going to look for a way to protect European companies that continue to do business. The question is, how hard is the Trump administration prepared to go after European companies that ignore the U.S. pulling out?
Two things, Chris. First, the wealth that was created in Iran as a result of the JCPOA drove Iranian malign activity. It fueled Qasem Soleimani. It fueled the IRGC. It provided resources for their work in Syria and Iraq. President Trump's withdrawal is aimed at denying them that wealth, denying them the resources to continue their bad behavior, to take the money away from them. The withdrawal wasn't aimed at the Europeans. I worked hard over the short time I've been the Secretary of State to try and fix the deal. We couldn't reach agreement with our E3 partners. I am hopeful in the days and weeks ahead we can come up with a deal that really works, that really protects the world from Iranian bad behavior, not just their nuclear program, but their missiles and their malign behavior as well. And I'll be working closely with the Europeans to try and achieve that, Chris.
But what about if the European companies and the European countries say, look, there's not going to be a renegotiation any more than there's going to be a renegotiation of the Paris Climate Accord? Is the U.S. prepared to go after companies in our allies, like Britain, France, and Germany, if they try to continue to do business?
The sanctions regime that is now in place is very clear about what the requirements are. My mission that I've been given by President Trump is to work to strike a deal that achieves the outcomes that protect America. That's what we're going to do, and I'll be hard at it with the Europeans in the next several days.
Couple of final questions. Israel. The U.S. opens its embassy in Jerusalem tomorrow. The Palestinians are talking about a day of rage, violent mass protests, and the PLO won't even talk to the U.S. anymore as an interlocutor in terms of the Middle East. Is the peace process dead? And given the threat of violence, what are you, as the Secretary of State, saying to Americans in the Middle East, in those parts of the world, over the next few days?
So the peace process is most decidedly not dead. We're hard at work on it. We hope we can achieve a successful outcome there as well. With respect to security, we're aware of the situation on the ground. The United States government has taken a number of actions to ensure that not only our governmental interests, but the American people in that region are secure as well, and we're comfortable we've taken action that reduces that risk.
Finally, and it's pretty remarkable given all that's happened, all that's on your brief, you have been Secretary of State for barely 2 weeks now. What's your vision for the State Department?
Well, first, Chris, I hope I haven't peaked in my first 2 weeks. But it's pretty clear. We've got to go put the diplomatic team on the playing field. It should be the United States State Department that is at the front of American foreign policy, delivering solutions to solve America's problems without resort to military force. And so I'm going to build the team. We're going to get our swagger back, and the State Department will be out in front in every corner of the world leading America's diplomatic policy, achieving great outcomes on behalf of President Trump and America.
Secretary Pompeo, thank you. Thanks for your time and a very busy schedule.
Thank you.
Always good to talk with you, sir.
Thank you, Chris.
Up next, we'll get reaction from the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, on the Trump-Kim summit and growing tensions in the Middle East.
Not having a good breakfast can make you feel like your day never started. Get going with Carnation Breakfast Essentials. It has protein plus 21 vitamins and minerals, including calcium and vitamin D, to help your family be their best. Carnation Breakfast Essentials.
When you're America's best value, you don't need a whole lot of hoopla. What you need is a 10-year, 100,000-mile warranty and an IIHS top safety pick award. When you've got all that, who needs balloons?
During Kia
Both risks and rewards to this high-stakes diplomacy, and we want to discuss that with Admiral Mike Mullen, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Presidents Bush and Obama. Admiral, welcome back.
Good to be with you.
You just heard Secretary Pompeo, and President Trump is also talking with growing optimism about his summit with Chairman Kim. Take a look.
I think it's going to be a very big success, but my attitude is, and if it isn't, it isn't, okay?
What do you think are the prospects for a Trump-Kim summit? What are the prospects that this will work out, that Kim will give up, as you just heard the Secretary say, give up his nuclear program and agree to give us means to verify it?
I think it's really uncertain. I want to give President Trump credit for getting to this point. He's moved the needle on this when that has not been done in the past, but I also think given the stakes, it's a very much high-risk, high-reward opportunity, and I think the downsides potentially are really, really significant as well.
All right, I want to talk to you about that because you gave a speech in Washington this week, and you talked about what could happen if this summit falls apart, if they walk away from Singapore without a deal. Let me put it up on the screen. If the talks do fall apart, excuse me, you didn't cough, I did. The failure is likely to stir the president's most bellicose, aggressive instincts. Are you saying, Admiral, that if there is no deal, that we could be worse off than if there had been no summit in the first place?
I think what I'm saying is if the talks fail, that the likelihood of options are dramatically reduced to potential conflict. And that's a huge worry. I think despite the progress that's been made to try to understand Kim Jong-un, there's a lot we don't understand. And that he would be significantly different from his father and his grandfather to make the kind of changes that are being discussed would be a huge, huge shift. And I'm more skeptical than I am optimistic that he would do that. That said, it could happen. But I do worry about the downside of conflict breaking out, where tens and hundreds of thousands of people, particularly in South Korea, could die very quickly. And Kim has a huge arsenal to include nuclear, chemical, biological weapons, and that the outbreak there could be huge. And I don't know that we've had much of a debate in the country about the potential outbreak of nuclear war, use of nuclear weapons, which haven't been used since 1945.
But you have said, you're on the record as saying that you do not believe in the feasibility, the utility of trying to contain North Korea, that we can't live with North Korea as an active nuclear threat. So if this agreement were to fall apart, what would you have President Trump do?
Well, I mean, that's I'm not really sure. Those are the stakes that we're playing for right now. I really want this agreement, or I want the result to be denuclearization complete, exactly what the president's seeking, and also not have any outbreak of war. That's a pretty thin lane to get into, particularly if the talks break down. I also think we need to put as much pressure on China to ensure that combat doesn't there is no combat outbreak, and certainly include our allies in Japan as well as the South Koreans in generating this kind of outcome. What I'm most concerned about is if this doesn't result in a positive outcome, the potential for, I think, military conflict goes up, and therefore you get into whether or not he would use the nuclear weapons.
Do you think, I mean, the question I have is, would we be better off, because you're saying if we get together and it falls apart, then there's not much more to talk about. Would it be better not to have the summit? Are you suggesting that maybe we're doing this too quickly?
Well, I think actually that's a hypothetical at this point. I think we're going to have it. It's another 30 days. There's going to be 30 days of prognosis about the pluses and the minuses here. But I am convinced it's going to happen. And I want to try to I want to try to understand what potential outcomes could be, both on the upside and the downside.
Let's turn to Iran and President Trump's decision to pull out of the nuclear deal with Tehran. Here he is.
It is clear to me that we cannot prevent an Iranian nuclear bomb under the decaying and rotten structure of the current agreement. The Iran deal is defective at its core.
You were the former chairman. You were the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. With the president's decision to pull out of the deal, has the risk of Iran developing a nuclear weapon, has it increased or diminished?
I think it's increased. I think it's actually increased fairly dramatically. I think one of the things we forget is how bright and capable the Iranians are, and that they can rebound from setbacks pretty quickly technically, and I think their capability could be developed very, very rapidly.
But you have criticized Iran for continuing its its missile program, its ballistic missile program, and that the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, did not stop that. It clearly did not curtail Iran's bad actions across the Middle East and its support for terror groups in a number of countries. Aren't there flaws in the deal that President Obama and John Kerry negotiated that had to be addressed?
I think we lose the context, if you will, of the JCPOA, which was very specifically focused on the nuclear weapons. And those weapons are so devastating that that focus, I think, was very well deserved. The other thing that I'm concerned about is if Iran gets nuclear weapons, that it will proliferate nuclear weapons in the region. So that's one thing. Secondly, we ought to press them as hard as possible to push back, bring as much pressure on their nefarious activities with respect to terrorism and support of terrorists, as well as their missile program, and do that with every available capability. And Iran has not acted well since the implementation of the JCPOA outside its requirements. Everyone I've spoken to says Iran is in full compliance with the specifics of the JCPOA, which eliminates their ability to develop nuclear weapons over a period of time.
Of course, the period of time ends, and that's one of the concerns of President Trump, is that in 2025 you have the sunset clause, and that apparently was the issue that broke us apart from the European allies, and that's when the president decided to pull out.
Yeah, I think clearly, eyes wide open, we knew going in that there was a sunset aspect of this. 10 years is a long time in some ways to look at it, in which case you would hope that there would be developments where they wouldn't develop them once that sunset clause went into effect.
I want to ask you about two other issues while I have you. What do you think of Gina Haspel's nomination to head the CIA? And do you believe, as some Democrats did in the confirmation hearing this week, that her involvement in enhanced interrogation after 9/11 somehow disqualifies her?
I've aligned myself with John McCain, Senator John McCain, for a long time on views of torture and what the standard is. He is the gold standard there, so I'm very supportive of the position he's taken in that regard. And I recognize lots of intelligence professionals I've talked to think Gina is an extraordinary person with a great background. That said, she has a past, and then recently, while she stated that she was in compliance with the law, where I think Senator McCain is where I am, that morally it was wrong, it was torture, and that she should be held responsible for that.
And therefore should not be the CIA director?
I'm not voting. I'll let those that vote make that decision.
But you would say that what you did was wrong?
I'm very much where Senator McCain is.
I'm sure that someone is going to note after your appearance here that back in 2016, Michael Bloomberg considered running for president, and he at one point vetted you as a possible running mate. So I'm sure someone's going to say, and I want to give you an opportunity to respond, hey, you're a never-Trumper.
No, I'm not. Actually, I'm not a never-Trumper. I've never said that, and worked hard to try to stay out of the politics of all this, quite frankly.
And so what is your attitude towards the president and the fact that you apparently were thinking of running with Michael Bloomberg?
Well, that was a time that I was focused with Michael Bloomberg on the possibilities. It never really came to fruition, and in the end, I honestly came to a point with my family that it really wasn't my kind of life, or that we would pursue anything like that.
Admiral Mullen, thank you. Thank you for coming in today and pursuing this life and talking to us. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris.
Up next, we'll bring in our Sunday group to discuss a foreign policy landscape that is shifting rapidly. Plus, now that we have a date and location, what would you like to ask the panel about the Trump-Kim summit? Just go to Facebook or Twitter at Fox News Sunday, and we may use your question on the air.
You wouldn't accept an incomplete job from anyone else. Why accept it from your allergy pills? Flonase relieves your worst symptoms, including nasal congestion, which most pills don't. Flonase helps block 6 key inflammatory substances. Most pills only block 1. Flonase.
This is Bill's yard, and Bill has a no weeds, not in my yard policy. But with Scott's Turf Builder Weed and Feed, Bill has nothing to worry about. It kills weeds and greens grass, guaranteed. This is a Scott's yard.
If you just sign that first
I'm
one
so
there.
sorry. I don't feel comfortable signing that.
I don't get the math here.
Was this the same car we talked about?
What's this dealer preparation fee?
I'm so sorry. This just is not
what we talked about.
Sunday group, GOP strategist Karl Rove, Charles Lane of the Washington Post, former Democratic Congresswoman Donna Edwards, and former National Security Council spokesman Michael Anton, now with Hillsdale College. Well, we ask you for questions for the panel, and on this issue of the Trump-Kim summit, we got this on Facebook from Weikert Vanderbend. What are the chances of tying denuking to a treaty giving Kim security? Michael, you heard me ask Secretary Pompeo about that. You heard his answer. How would you answer Weikert?
I would say that that is one of the goals that the South Koreans and the North Koreans, they want to, the Korean War never formally ended. They want a peace treaty that formally ends the Korean War. I think if I were in the administration or giving advice to the administration, I would hold that out as a carrot toward the end. It's not something you give up front. You see what you can get on the denuclearization front. The destruction of that one site, as the Secretary of State said, is very positive. But for this to work, there are going to have to be robust inspections. The North Koreans are going to essentially have to lay bare their entire program and let people crawl all over it and confirm that they're shutting things down, destroying things, they're not hiding.
But were you surprised that Pompeo made it as explicit as he did in our interview? Look, if we get all of that, we're willing to say, Kim, you can stay in power.
I was not surprised, just because I've known from the beginning that the policy of this administration has never been regime change. I think people such as Admiral Mullen, who are most concerned about conflict, the point I would make to them is, making U.S. policy explicitly regime change, that's how you, in a way, up the chances of conflict, because you scare the North Korean regime so much that if it thinks its survival is on the line, it's much more likely to do risky things, whereas if it thinks the United States is willing to live with it, hopefully that reduces pressure and calms them down a little bit and makes them less likely to do risky things.
Congresswoman Edwards, what do you think of the way that President Trump is approaching this summit? And when the president praises Kim for releasing the hostages, and you see Democratic Senate leader Chuck Schumer on the floor criticizing him for that, doesn't that add to the sense that the Democrats won't give credit to Donald Trump for anything he does?
No, I mean, I think it was positive that these three Americans were released. The question is, that is a precursor. Even the dismantling of the nuclear site is a precursor. My question is, what are Americans going to get, and how are we going to verify that we've gotten something of substance? I mean, I remain a little skeptical about the ability to negotiate denuclearization in North Korea, but I think it would be a positive development, obviously, if that happened. But I don't want to hang too many hopes on what's going to happen on June 12th in Singapore.
Let's also turn to Iran, and the president's decision to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal here was part of Mr. Trump's announcement.
If we do nothing, we know exactly what will happen. In just a short period of time, the world's leading state sponsor of terror will be on the cusp of acquiring the world's most dangerous weapons.
Carl, we all understand that there are gaps in the deal, gaps about Iranian behavior, about Iran's ballistic missile program, about the question of the sunset clause. But after failing to get a deal with the Europeans, and that was the effort to, yes, we'll keep this deal, but we'll add on these other measures, you heard the president, you heard Mike Pompeo talk about the Iranians coming back to the negotiating table. How realistic is that?
Well, actually pretty realistic. If you saw the comments yesterday of the foreign minister of Iran, he talked, first of all, the threat. We're going to restart our program on a, quote, industrial scale. But then he immediately pivoted and said, basically, we're going to be sitting down with the Europeans to see if we can salvage the deal. And literally this week...
But he's talking about salvaging the deal with the French and the...
I know.
Not with the U.S.
I know, but here's the deal. This is the risky strategy of the Trump administration, in my opinion. The 3 M's are going to be meeting with them, May, Merkel, and Macron. And the question is, has the United States, through Pompeo and others, and through the president, we know there have been conversations with all 3 of them, has the administration signaled what it wants? And then are the Europeans going to be willing to carry those issues forward with the Iranians, and are the Iranians going to be willing to do a deal? That 3 steps could fall apart at any one of them, but I took it as a sign when the Iranians, after their typical bellicose rhetoric, said we're going to try and salvage the deal. Because look, remember, they got problems. They've got an economy that's in meltdown. They've got domestic unrest, and then you have the Europeans concerned about the impact of sanctions from the United States that would affect companies in their countries, which are already a little nervous about doing business with Iran. But so it's going to be difficult. No guarantee of success. But if the president has been clear with the Europeans as to what he wants out of a better deal, whether it's anytime, any place inspections, get rid of make prohibitions rather than caps, maybe there's a way forward.
Chuck, you think that is the